The origins of the Ashkenazi are some of the most mysterious in all of Europe. Claiming descent from the ancient Israelites, they took a prominent place in Central and Eastern Europe during the late Middle Ages. But how did they get there? When? And are they really the descendants of the ancient populations of the Levant? I am well aware of the sensitivity of this topic, and I approach it with utmost respect, humility, and truth. Conspiracies will be challenged with genetic evidence and historical facts, and the true origins of the Ashkenazi will emerge from the mists of history. Hi friends, I'm Kevin McLean. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and consider supporting the channel on Patreon, PayPal, or through YouTube Super Stickers. Remember, you can also get this program ad-free if you subscribe through YouTube, or you can subscribe over on Patreon. Your support helps me to make videos like this. Thank you all so much for your continued support. Perhaps the most appropriate place to start is the name itself. Ashkenazi is derived from the biblical figure Ashkenaz, a son of Gomer. In Jewish tradition, everyone in the world descends from Noah, and this forced Jewish people and later Christians to try to explain the origins of every people in the world according to the sons of Noah. As awareness of the extent of the world and its people grew, so too did the explanations and the historical movements used to explain them. For instance, Gomer was said by ancient Jewish historian Josephus to be the origins of the Celts, through the Cimmerians, then the Gauls and Galatians. A major book publisher in Wales is called Gomer Press because of this. Originally, the son Ashkenaz seems to have been derived from the name of the Assyrians, but begins to be applied to the kingdom of Urartu. In the 10th century AD History of Armenia by John Catholicos, he says that their people were originally called Ashkenaz, and were the descendants of him, which is derived from its earlier use to refer to the general region of the South Caucasus, as opposed to Gomer being associated with the Cimmerians north of the Caucasus Mountains. For the reason of dividing different regions of Europe into different descendants of Japheth, the Jewish people living in Iberia became known as the Sephardics, those of France the Tsarfat. We know that the Ashkenazi must have been primarily dwelling in South and Central Germany, because their language, Yiddish, developed from Old High German. By the 10th century, the towns of Mainz, Worms, and Speyer were the core of the Ashkenazi culture. Though beginning in the 10th century, we actually know quite a lot about the history of the Ashkenazi. There are many hundreds of years where written history tells us very little. This led to some early incorrect but originally well-meaning theories, which have lingered far past their expiry date. The most pernicious and widespread of these is the Khazar Theory. The Khazars were a Turkish group from Central Asia, which pushed west into what is now European Russia in the 6th century AD. They established their power center north of the Caucasus, approximately where the Cimmerians had previously resided. And from there they spread out along the Don, Volga, and Dnieper rivers. Due to some of the symbols that they employed, and some vague historical commentary, some believe that at least the Khazar leadership had converted to Judaism. A quite unusual event if true. The Khazars would come face to face with the forces of the Rus, and would be completely defeated by the Slavs around the 10th century. An early modern Jewish scholar proposed that the Khazars were the origins of the Ashkenazi, due to the location of their former rule and their supposed Jewish religion. By the end of the medieval period, many of the Ashkenazi were living in the east in what is now Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, and the Khazars appeared to provide an easy answer for how they got there. But this easy answer was the wrong answer, and has since been utilized to maliciously claim that the Ashkenazi Jewish people have no actual connection to the historical Israelites. Firstly, the origins of the Yiddish language itself disproves the Khazar theory. The language of the Khazars was a form of Turkish, and how an Eastern European Turkish-derived group would end up speaking a language derived from Old High German goes completely unanswered by this theory. The known medieval history of the development of the Ashkenazi in Germany likewise disproves it. However, it can also now be disproved conclusively genetically. This is a genetic sample of a modern Ashkenazi Jewish person from Poland. Below is its closest genetic matches with other modern Eurasian genetic samples. What we see is that despite dwelling in Poland for hundreds of years, and despite having no recorded historical contact, the Polish Ashkenazi are more closely related to all other Ashkenazi and to Jewish populations throughout Europe and the Mediterranean than they are to Poles. Now, it can be noticed that there is a proximity to certain Anatolian groups, but this is explained not due to Turkish origins, but because these Anatolian Turks are predominantly the descendants of a pre-Turkish population, especially those Turks dwelling along the Mediterranean. This is why you can also see that the Ashkenazi group fairly closely with people from southern Italy and from Greece. There is simply no reality to the Khazar theory. When we look at the male haplogroups, the J lines, which represent the plurality of male Ashkenazi lineages, are unquestionably of Levantine origins. The most significant line, other than J, is E1b. Now, at first glance, this could look Greek or South Italian in origin, but on closer inspection, a significant amount of these E haplogroups are not EV13, but are EM123, which is specifically of Levantine origin. A minority, however, can be attributed to ancient Greek or Italian male admixture. This is also the case for some of the around 8% of R1a, which belongs to R1a M582, a branch which developed in the Middle East, likely originally spread by an ancient Indo-Iranian population. Now, around 10% of Ashkenazi carry the haplogroup R1b, which does mostly appear to represent male European ancestry, likely Germanic. So we can see from the male haplogroups that a surprising amount of Ashkenazi male lineage originates from the region of ancient Israel. Given that they lived as a small minority group for so long in Europe while maintaining their lineages is an impressive feat of history. However, in contrast to this remarkable male continuity, there is a notable overall autosomal admixture from outside the Levant. This admixture is predominantly female-driven, meaning that Jewish men were taking non-Jewish wives, who would then be integrated into the community. This is an entirely normal thing with migrating populations, and it also occurs in many other cases during the spread of Indo-Europeans, for instance. Some estimates suggest that upwards of 80% of female Ashkenazi mitochondrial DNA is of European origins. Mitochondrial haplogroup, which are prominent among Ashkenazi women, are almost certainly from Southern Europe, likely Italy and Greece specifically. Much of this admixture seems to have happened very early on, before the major population movement separated the different Jewish groups into different parts of Europe. The Ashkenazi are indeed descended from the ancient Israelites, who carried their traditions, beliefs, and identity into Europe long before many would assume, before even many modern European ethnic groups even existed. When the ancestors of the Hungarians were still in Asia, when southern Germany and Austria was still Celtic, when the Thracians and Celts battled for control of the Balkans, in the times before Caesar had conquered Gaul, the ancestors of the Ashkenazi were already living in southern Europe. Though the DNA does not tell us the exact dates of this, history provides us with a fairly clear guide. The earliest surviving historical account of the Jewish people in Europe is made by Marcus Tullius Cicero in 56 BC. I will quote the relevant section, but please be advised that he does advance certain negative stereotypes. There follows the odium that is attached to Jewish gold. There is no doubt the reason why this case is being tried not far from the Aurelian steppes. You procured this place and that crowd, Laelius. For this trial, you know what a big crowd it is, how they stick together, how influential they are in informal assemblies. So I will speak in a low voice, so that only the jurors may hear me. For those are not wanting who would incite them against me, and against every respectable man. I shall not help them to do this more easily. When every year it was customary to send gold to Jerusalem on the order of the Jews from Italy, and from all of our provinces, Flaccus forbade by an edict its exportation from Asia. Who is there, gentlemen, who could not honestly praise this action? The Senate often earlier, and also in my consulship, most urgently forbade the export of gold. But to resist this barbaric superstition was an act of firmness. To defy the crowd of Jews when sometimes in our assemblies they were hot with passion for the welfare of the state was an act of the greatest seriousness. Now this commentary by Cicero tells us many important things. By 56 BC, the Jewish community in Italy, and in Rome specifically, was large enough that it was having a notable impact on the politics and economy of the empire. The issue at hand was that Flaccus, the governor of Asia, was being accused of misappropriation of the gold that the Jewish community was trying to send to the temple in Jerusalem. Cicero defends the decision, basically saying that Flaccus was trying to prevent what would now be called capital flight. Gold was sent back to Jerusalem to help support the temple. Apparently, the amounts were large enough that it actually concerned the political elite. Cicero mentions the Aurelian steppes because they were said to be a gathering place for the Jewish community in Rome, not far from the temple of Castor and Pollux. But he's also aware that the name Aurelian means golden. He accuses Laelius, the tribune of the plebs, who is acting as the lead prosecutor, of intentionally influencing the trial through Jewish community mobilization. The crowds are insinuated by Cicero to be primarily Jewish. However, his dislike for the Jewish community is equaled by his dislike for the Greeks, expressed clearly when he says, "Still, this I can say of the whole race of the Greeks. I grant them literature. I grant them a knowledge of many arts. I do not deny the charm of their speech, the keenness of their intellects, the richness of their diction. Finally, if they make any other claim, I do not deny it. But truth and honor in giving testimony that nation has never cherished. The meaning, the importance, the value of this whole matter they know not. Whence comes the saying, 'Testify for me, and I'll testify for you.' It isn't thought to be Gallic, is it? Or Spanish? It is so entirely Greek that
even those who do not understand Greek know the Greek words for this expression.
Cicero tried to argue the case that the Greeks and Jews were conspiring together to undermine proper Roman rule. Now, what's important here is that by 56 BC, the Jewish community was already a significant player in the politics of Rome and had become a factor in political and economic discussions. Unfortunately, there is no surviving ancient account which fully explains the origins of this settlement, but the core community must have existed prior to the Roman conquest of Israel. This can be shown by later references by Valerius Maximus, writing around 30 AD, who claimed that Cornelius Hispaulus, in 139 BC, expelled Jews from Rome, saying, "Hispaulus also expelled from the city the Jews who had tried to transmit their sacred rites to Romans." Other Roman accounts likewise claim that, at least during particular periods, some Jewish communities engaged in proselytizing, which to the Romans was a violation of custom, which held that each people should maintain their own ancestral traditions. Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century AD, says, "As the Jews flocked to Rome in great numbers and were converting many of the natives to their ways, he, Germanius Tiberius, banished most of them." Later, the Christians who developed out of the Jewish community would be the most well-known and successful proselytizers. The initial major flow of Jewish peoples into Italy can perhaps be traced to the conquest of Greece. Alexander the Great had conquered the region of Israel around 332 BC, which brought the ancient Israelites under Greek political authority. In Greece, the presence of a Jewish community is archaeologically attested as early as the 3rd century BC, recording the manumission of a Jewish slave. From the 2nd century onward, there is archaeological evidence for a notable Jewish community in Delos. Delos was a major trading hub used by the Phoenicians. Jews were playing an important role in the trade of Delos. The Romans transformed it into a free port in 167, and a significant amount of trade in the eastern Mediterranean would transit through Delos. During this period, there is evidence for a major Jewish community, including a building which some scholars believe was a synagogue. Under the Ptolemaic kingdom, the Jewish community in Egypt would dramatically expand. This is why many notable early Jewish scholars came from Egypt, such as Flavius Josephus and Philo. Josephus detailed this long, close relationship between the Jewish community and the Greek elite, which saw Jews increasingly becoming native Greek speakers, translating their works into Greek, and becoming adepts in Greek philosophy. This is why the Tanakh, or Old Testament, was translated into Greek. When the Romans took control of the Greek world, it provided an obvious opportunity for some entrepreneurial people in the community to expand into other regions of the Roman Empire, which then spanned the entire Mediterranean. And we can only rely on the words of later writers, such as Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish Neoplatonist. He wrote about an anti-Jewish pogrom that took place in Alexandria around 1 AD. He said, "For it was sufficiently evident that the report about the destruction of the synagogues which took its rise in Alexandria would be immediately spread over all the districts of Egypt, and would extend from that country to the east and to the oriental nations, and from the borders of the land in other directions, and from the Mareotic district, which is the frontier of Libya, towards the setting of the sun in the western nations. For no one country can contain the whole Jewish nation, by reason of its populousness, on which account they frequent all the most prosperous and fertile countries of Europe and Asia, whether island or continent, looking indeed upon the holy city,
as their metropolis, in which is erected the sacred temple of Most High God. But accounting those regions which they have been occupied by their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers, and still more remote ancestors, in which they have been born and brought up as their country. And there are even some regions to which they came in the very moment that they were originally settled, sending a colony of their people to do a pleasure to the founders of the colony. And there was reason to fear lest all the populace in every country, taking what was done in Egypt as a model and as an excuse, might insult those Jews who were their fellow citizens by introducing new regulations with respect to their synagogues and their national customs. Thus, already by 1 AD, Jews had spread all across Asia and Europe, and he feared that their communities might end up the target of further attacks. Some of these communities had been established by distant ancestors, meaning that they were already very ancient by the time Philo is writing. According to Philo, the Jewish community in Rome at that time primarily dwelt on the far side of the Tiber, around the area of the Vatican Hill. He said, "How then did Augustus look upon this great division of Rome, which is on the other side of the river Tiber, which he was well aware was occupied and inhabited by Jews? And they were mostly Roman citizens, for having been brought as captives into Italy, they were manumitted by those who had bought them as slaves, without ever having been compelled to alter any of their hereditary or national observances. Therefore he knew that they had synagogues, and that they were in the habit of visiting them, and most especially on the sacred Sabbath days, when they publicly cultivate their national philosophy. He knew also that they were in the habit of contributing sacred sums of money from their first fruits and sending them to Jerusalem by the hands of those who were to conduct the sacrifices. However, the Roman elite were suspicious and not quick to like any outside group. The historian Tacitus scathingly reports what were likely widespread feelings among many Roman elite. And I would like to warn viewers that he deploys very negative stereotypes here. For the worst rascals among other peoples, renouncing their ancestral religions, always keep sending tribute and contributions to Jerusalem, thereby increasing the wealth of the Jews. Again, the Jews are extremely loyal towards one another, and always ready to show compassion. But towards every other people they feel only hatred and enmity. They sit apart at meals, and they sleep apart. They adopted circumcision to distinguish themselves from other peoples by this difference. Those who are converted to their ways follow the same practice, and the earliest lesson they receive is to despise the gods, to disown their country, and to regard their parents, children, and brothers as of little account. Now, because the Jewish community had set itself apart from non-Jews, this created a resentment that bleeds through in Tacitus's words. But it was this exact same tendency that allowed the Jewish people to not be absorbed into the broader Roman society and disappear as a distinct people. And again, we see a reference made to conversions, and such conversions likely account for the majority of non-Levantine male haplogroups among the Ashkenazi. The last line of Tacitus is startlingly similar to a line which Jesus says in Matthew 10. This is proof that the custom did not originate with Jesus and the Christians, but was part of a long tradition within the Jewish community, where converts would be required to abandon their families and become Jewish in every way. The rites of the Christians altered the original methods of this, but the spirit remained similar. In 19 AD, these actions would provoke Emperor Tiberius Germanicus to expel Jews from Rome into Sardinia unless they abandoned their religious practices. 4,000 were reported by Flavius Josephus to have been expelled, but following the death of the emperor,
it's believed that many returned. For in 49 AD, Emperor Claudius, the man who began the conquest of Britain and banned Druidism, was said to have expelled Jews from the city again. According to the writer Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, the Jewish community had been worked up into a frenzy by a certain Christus, who is always causing trouble. It seems they're referring to Jesus Christ. The Bible contains corroboration of this event in Acts 18, which says, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. Yet though Aquila may have left Rome, it seems that many others did not, or quickly returned, because not long after we have clear proof of a large Jewish presence there. The early spread of Christianity can be entirely traced to the Jewish communities throughout Asia and Europe. The reason the religion was able to spread so quickly was because these communities were tightly connected, despite their geographic separation. Paul, who was instrumental in establishing Christianity, was a Jew of the Pharisees tradition from Tarsus, a trading city in what is now Turkey. When he became a Christian, he used his extensive trade network throughout the empire to travel to many different places, but mostly working within the established Jewish communities there to convert people. Paul is mentioned as passing through the region of the Galatians, and in the Epistle to the Galatians, we can even see that Jews were dwelling among the Celts in Anatolia. Now, of course, Paul also traveled to Rome. On his way, he stops at Puteoli, where it says, There we found some brothers and sisters, and were invited to stay with them for 7 days. And that is how we came to Rome. So who are these brothers and sisters? They could not have been Christians at this point. Who he means are fellow Jews. When he goes to Rome, the first thing he does, according to Acts, is, After 3 days, Paul called together those who were the leading men of the Jews. So there is absolutely no question. The Jewish community was solidly established across Greece and at least in several places in Italy by the 1st century, and it maps directly with the spread of Christianity. When Paul or others in the Bible speak about Gentiles, they're not referring to non-Christians, but to non-Jews. In Rome, there are a number of catacombs dated to the early empire. While the most famous are Christian catacombs, there are also exclusively Jewish ones. Some population estimates suggest that by the time of the spread of Christianity, the Jewish population in Rome and Ostia was around 40 to 50,000, or at least 5% of the total population. Now, it's no coincidence that the regions in Greece and Italy also appear to match with the locations of the primary underlying European admixture among Ashkenazi. Many of the early Christians were Hellenized or Romanized Jews, those who had been losing their attachment to their traditional Jewish religion and customs, many of whom no longer spoke Hebrew or Aramaic, but only Greek or Latin. In Acts, the name of the exiled Roman Jew Aquila gives testimony to this, as it's a traditional Roman name, not Jewish. To these people, Christianity may have provided them a way out, but it also provided them a new way to maintain an attachment and continuity with their Jewish identity. Many non-Hellenized Jews saw it as a betrayal of their people, their religion, and their traditions. It was a kind of spiritual civil war, not confined to Judea, but in every Jewish community across the empire. The Bible depicts just this in the crucifixion of Jesus, but it tells the account from only one side. From the viewpoint of the traditional Jewish community, Jesus was a rebel who was trying to overthrow the traditional Jewish religion and leadership. Had he and those who followed him succeeded in converting all of the Jews, there would today be no Jewish people. Over several generations, the Jews who did convert stopped being Jews and just became Christians of whatever nation they dwelt in, merging together with the non-Jewish populations.
while at the same time it was the Christian Jews, likely due to their efforts at conversion, which were increasingly drawing the ire of the Roman state. This was realized brutally in the acts of Nero in 64, when the Christians were blamed for the fire and subjected to the worst deaths. Just a few short years later, however, the Roman-Jewish War would break out, as Jews in the traditional lands of Israel would attempt to rebel against Roman rule. The rebels were crushed, and the Second Temple looted and destroyed. Under the subsequent rule of Vespasian, a special Jewish tax was introduced, where Jews were specifically targeted with extra tax burdens just for being Jewish. These tragic events marked the end of Jewish political autonomy for nearly 2,000 years. With the center of Jewish traditions and religious worship no more, the strong religious ties to their ancestral homeland were weakened. It may have led to more Jewish people moving to Italy and other parts of the empire, but by the 2nd century AD, much of the growth of the Jewish community in Europe is thought to have been internal to Europe itself. How and why did a group of Roman and Greek Jews move into southern Germany, and when? Strangely enough, it might have begun in a far earlier time than what's often supposed. The first Jewish person that we know to have lived in Gaul is recorded in an account by Josephus, speaking of an event around 6 AD. Herod Archelaus was a client ruler of Judea on behalf of Rome. He is best known as the tyrant King Herod from the Bible. Due to his misdeeds and the reorganization of the empire, Herod was sent into exile in, of all places, Vienna. No, not that Vienna. A place in Gaul known by the same name, seemingly named for the river that it was situated along. It was the capital of the Gaulish tribe of the Allobroges, about 35 kilometers south of Lyon. It had become a major urban center by the time of Herod's banishment there, and would have been seen as the perfect place to establish a trading network from north to south. Far from a backwater, it rivaled Lugdunum for its grandeur, but was far enough away from political power and trouble. When a figure like Herod, effectively a king, goes into exile, he doesn't go alone. He goes with an entire court, his retinue, his extended family, and then their family, and their retinues, etc. When he went to Vienna, he or members of his extended family would have set about establishing businesses, perhaps establishing trading, which they excelled in. This would have drawn more Jewish people north, especially in times when they were facing increasing persecution elsewhere. Even before Herod, there may have been Jewish presence in Gaul. In Gallia Narbonensis, a lamp with the symbol of the menorah has been recovered dated to between 27 BC and 14 AD. We know that Jewish people were spread out in many different locations by the 2nd and 3rd century AD, but there is slim archaeological traces. In Arles, Gaul, a Jewish sarcophagus has been found dating to the 3rd century. Beyond the identified crypts in Rome and some others in Venosa and Naples, there are no clear Jewish burial sites. It is instead to the law records and church canon that we have to turn to see the earliest locations of Jewish communities. With the rise to power of Constantine in 306 and the legalization of Christianity, which quickly moved to the political domination of Christianity, new problems were emerging for the Jewish people, and some of the early laws reflect this. There were laws against converting to Judaism. There is even a law in 339 which says that women who had been working in an imperial weaving factories, yes, the Romans had state factory production, but who had been taken as wives or partners by Jews must be restored to the factories, and that Christian women could not be joined with Jewish men. Already by 321, we have clear evidence that there was an established Jewish community in Cologne, Germany. A law was passed in Cologne which explained that Jews could be called up to the Curia, but that some few of them could be exempted. This proves not only that there was a Jewish community established along the Rhine in the 4th century, but also that it was large enough that specific laws and exemptions were being made for them. They must also have had very wealthy members, as serving in the Curia entailed potentially significant financial expenses. Though evidence is lacking, it's reasonable to assume that Jewish presence existed all along the Roman Rhine frontier, possibly even going down to Mainz, Worms, and Speyer even at this early time. Another sign of how large and powerful the Jewish community had become within the empire was that when Julian the Exalted, whom the Christians call the Apostate, had gained office, he wrote a special address to the Jewish community. He apologized to them on behalf of the state for past wrongs done to them, ordered the repeal of the Jewish tax, called the Jewish patriarch his brother, and promised to rebuild Jerusalem once he had concluded the war with Persia. Clearly, at the very least, he was seeking the support of the Jewish community, very likely to help him counter his Christian opponents, which suggests that they were notable power players. Unfortunately, he was killed in the battle with the Persians, and Christians were immediately able to regain political power. By the 400s AD, there were Jewish communities in various sizes in most of the major Roman centers in northern Italy, Gaul, and the Germanic frontier. The Sirmondian Constitution of 425, issued to the Praetorian prefects of Gaul, stated specifically that Jews and pagans were to be denied the right to plead a legal case or to serve in the military, nor was any Christian to be placed under the authority of a Jew or pagan. Laws in Ravenna dating to 412 to 423 restricted the building of synagogues. And for those who claim that the lack of such places proved Jewish communities didn't exist there, the fact is they were typically not allowed to have them, so any such places would have been secret and unidentifiable to us. One reason for the rapid expansion of the Jewish community was due to their traditions. While pagan Romans were engaging in contraception, abortion, and exposure of children, and converted Christians were celebrating and promoting celibacy, the Jewish community embraced producing large families. Historian Tacitus reports that it was a violation of their law to expose children, and that they therefore had a very high birth rate and large families. Likely their population remained a very small minority, but their numbers were clearly expanding during the period, and this is despite conversions to Christianity, and despite the general collapse of the Western Roman Empire. It isn't certain how their communities fared during the collapse. Some have suggested they did not survive, but early Germanic laws and canon suggest otherwise. In 461, Jews were said to have attended the funeral of the Christian Archbishop of Arles. Around the same time, Sidonius Apollinaris of Arles also writes about Jewish converts in the city, whom he knew, putting beyond doubt that there was a notable Jewish presence in the city. In 465, in Vannes, Brittany, the council of the city passed a decree stating that Christian clerics were prohibited from sharing a meal with Jews, confirming that a Jewish community existed there as well, showing that from north to south, Gaul had a solid Jewish population. After the conquest of the Franks, many decrees were issued against Jewish people. Most of them date to around the 6th and 7th century, but reveal what must have been a large Jewish settlement across much of central and northern Gaul in places like Orleans, Clermont, Macon, Paris. The Burgundians likewise were issuing edicts against Jews forbidding Christian-Jewish marriage, doubting the authenticity of Jewish conversions to Christianity, and restricting Jewish participation in governance. Jews were prohibited from being out in the streets between Holy Thursday and Easter, and they were not allowed to be called as witnesses to give evidence in court. Christians were forbidden from taking part in any Jewish festivals or to celebrate Sunday in a Jewish character. In Iberia, among the Visigoths, there was an identical trend, which reached feverish proportions. This wave of anti-Semitism among the Germanic kingdoms culminated in attempts at forced conversion or expulsion. Dagobert I, king of the Franks around 629, ordered the conversion of all the Jews in his territory. Those who refused conversion were to be expelled. Dagobert began as king in Austrasia, the western zone of the Frankish realm. This is the region in which Cologne is located, and where early evidence showed a Jewish community. It's not certain how many people were affected by this, but some of the laws mentioned earlier seem to line up with this effort at forced conversion, and were intended to ensure that the Jewish people who claimed to convert were not continuing their customs. It was in this same period that there was a big push on the Gaelic and British Christians to change their dating of Easter so that it did not match up with that of the Jewish Passover. Because of this concerted effort to create a total separation, not from its Jewish roots, which no one ever denied, but from the Jewish community, which existed alongside them throughout Europe. The Merovingian kingdom came to an end shortly after Dagobert, and the rise of Charlemagne saw a different approach to the Jewish community, at least by the state. That change was brought about by Pepin the Short, king of the Franks and father of the even more illustrious Charlemagne. Pepin's father, Charles the Hammer Martel, had a history of combat with the Umayyad, and his son Pepin followed in his footsteps. He undertook the conquest of Septimania, which had fallen into the hands of the Umayyad Caliphate. He broke their hold of the region in the siege of Narbonne in 759. Yet legend states that Pepin had help from the inside. The Jewish community of Narbonne was large, and some of the earliest named historical Jewish figures in France came from there, such as Machir of Narbonne, who was a contemporary of Pepin and Charlemagne. Pepin solicited the aid of Machir in his effort to retake the city and promised widespread reforms that would give greater freedom to the Jewish people in return for their support. The Jewish community went over to support the Frankish king. It was perhaps this incident which built the close alliance that Pepin and his son fostered with the Jewish community. Charlemagne followed through with this family alliance, granting extensive lands to the Jewish community in Narbonne, and even reportedly granting Machir a noble title. True to his father's promise, the laws restricting Jewish activities were dramatically relaxed. Effectively, all Jewish people in the empire were under the specific protection of Charlemagne. He allowed them to build synagogues and appointed a Jewish trader from Narbonne as his ambassador to Baghdad. Isaac, the envoy of Charlemagne, was born in Narbonne, France, sometime in the mid to late 700s. A successful merchant, he gained the eye of Charlemagne, with whom he maintained a close lifelong friendship. The emperor would send him on a special diplomatic mission to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, and he secured a gift of an elephant. Isaac, however, is just one man who is fortunate enough to break through into written history. He came from a widespread and very successful community, which was spread all across the Frankish kingdom. This cordial treatment of the Jewish community continued under Charlemagne's son, but would begin to wane with future leaders. By around 850, it may be that their most concentrated settlements were along the Rhine. While our earliest evidence placed them in Cologne, their later centers were Mainz, Worms, and Speyer, all locations further south along the Rhine. It was these communities who first began to self-identify as Ashkenazi, the Jews who lived in the lands of the descendants of Ashkenaz. Folk accounts point towards leading Jewish figures moving to Mainz from Lucca in northern Italy, and almost certainly there is some truth to these accounts. It may have been the case that due to Charlemagne's and his son's close relationship with the community, that many Jews in the south decided to make the move north. However, the reason to move to Mainz, Worms, and Speyer specifically was very likely contacts with an established Jewish community already in the region. By the 10th century,
The Mainz, Speyer, and Worms region had become known to the wider Jewish community as a place of great learning. However, Jewish communities in the West were also still very important, such as Troyes, France, where one of the towering figures of the Ashkenazi religious tradition emerged, Shlomo Yitzhaki, known simply as Rashi, born in 1040, whose commentaries on the Talmud and Tanakh, as well as many other writings and poetry, became a lasting part of Ashkenazi Jewish traditions. The town was a central trading hub with the Jewish community playing a leading role, and where the term Troy, referring to the weighting of gold, comes from. Some Jews had also settled further east by this time. Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, a Jewish traveler from Spain, recorded an established Jewish community in Prague in 956. Due to the laws of Charlemagne, they were able to build synagogues, and it was during this time that Yiddish began to develop, evolving out of Old High German, though Hebrew was retained as a religious language studied by teachers and scholars. Yet by the turn of the 11th century, there was a constant threat that things might take a dark turn. Because they were a visible outgroup who did not share the religious traditions of the larger communities they lived in, and because they were involved in trade, commerce, and money lending, they were a very visible target. Word had spread through Christendom of the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Rumors were circulating that the Jewish community was involved and somehow to blame, despite their own communities in the region also being targeted. This flared up in various regions across the Frankish kingdom, with local bishops or other church leaders on a local level ordering the forced conversion of Jews or else trying to expel them, culminating in outright slaughter in 1097. The so-called People's Crusade, not much more than a disorganized mob, descended upon the Jewish communities in Cologne and Mainz and elsewhere en route to Jerusalem. They murdered thousands of unarmed men, women, and children, despite official condemnation by the church and state authorities. This initial slaughter is thought to have driven the first wave of Ashkenazi Jews further east into Hungary, Bohemia, and Poland. The protection of the Jewish community in Western Europe was growing weaker all the time, and periodic attacks, forced conversions, and expulsions would become a norm. By 1182, King Philip II ordered the expulsion of all Jews from royal lands and seized their assets. In 1234, King Louis, under instruction from Pope Gregory IX, attempted to destroy by fire all copies of the Talmud and other Jewish writings in Paris. Then, in order to finance his crusade, he ordered the confiscation of all the property of any Jewish person involved in moneylending. Increasingly, the Jewish community was forced to live in segregated ghettos, and in some cases wear identifiers which marked them out as Jewish. In 1306, Philip the Fair would issue another expulsion and property confiscation. In 1315, Louis X allowed them back, but by 1320 there was already more violence, with the so-called Shepherds leading a religious extremist movement which created their own unsanctioned crusading army that committed pogroms against the Jews and lepers, where hundreds were killed. Then, during the Black Death, again Jews were blamed, leading to massive pogroms across many regions of Europe, and the murder of tens of thousands of Jewish people. In 1394, there was a final medieval expulsion of the Jewish community from France by Charles VI. Due in part to opportunities opening up in Eastern Europe, and by a larger part driven by the constant violence and physical expulsions, Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi Jews began to spread further and further east. In the late 900s, some had already settled in Prague, but the major movements began around the 12th century, following the Crusader pogroms. In 1244, Austria adopted a charter which offered royal protections to the Jewish people. Then, in 1251, Hungary did likewise. And they were followed in 1254 by Bohemia, which issued a charter which gave royal protection and jurisdiction to Jewish people. In 1264, Prince Boleslav the Pious issued a charter for Jews living in Greater Poland, and Lithuania soon followed. Now, these protections for Jews were not, I think, done out of goodness and compassion. They were rather a crafty means of drawing Jewish financial wealth east, wealth that the elites there wanted a cut of. Yet for the Jewish community, it was the best offer on hand, and many made the move. Many of them had no choice. When Jewish people were expelled from France in 1394, Vienna in 1420, and Mainz, Worms, and Speyer in the 1430s, most of the Yiddish speakers had to go east, leading to a massive concentration of Jewish communities in these regions. Though they were now forced into Slavic-speaking regions, they maintained their Germanic Yiddish language. By the late 1300s, there were sizable Jewish communities in Poland, Hungary, Bohemia, and especially the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Lithuania at that time also comprised most of what is today Belarus and parts of Poland and Ukraine. With the consolidation of Poland and Lithuania, this region became the new center of the Ashkenazi. Their population was blossoming, and they helped establish some of the most beautiful towns and cities in the region. However, things were not without issue, and uprisings in the 1600s would see Jewish communities again targeted for raiding and plunder. The Russian state would also strive not to attract Jews, but to keep them out of Russia. However, this policy was turned on its head when, in their military conquest of Poland in the 1700s, they acquired vast territories settled by Jewish people. Their answer to this was to create what is known as the Pale of Settlement, which sought to contain the Jewish community within this designated region. Though there is much important history which is left out, this brings us up roughly to the modern age and the political developments which are much more familiar and even more grave. The origins of the Ashkenazi can be clearly seen as a continuous development from those very early Jewish trading communities in Greece and Italy, incubating in northern Italy and France, and moving along the Rhine, and finally being practically forced into Eastern Europe, where their community again blossomed, but ended up facing containment, pogroms, and eventually the Holocaust. But their tale is not simply one of perpetual woe, but of tenacity, persistence, and success even in the face of the most difficult challenges. By sticking together as a community, bound together by a common history, ancestry, and tradition, they maintained their own identity against all the odds. They suffered, and they overcame. They were driven out, and they planted anew, with the vigor and tenacity of the grapevine, bearing so many fruits. I'd like to thank you all for watching, and if you like this program, please like, share, and subscribe, and consider supporting my channel on Patreon, PayPal, through YouTube Super Stickers, or become a member of the channel, where you will gain access to ad-free videos. And I also post all my videos over on Patreon. Thank you so much for your support, and as always, stand tall.